When we explore the chronicles of America's Midwestern heartland, the narrative typically unfolds in vibrant hues of golden grain fields and lush, optimistic emerald landscapes. The iconic image of a leaping deer adorns the sides of enormous agricultural equipment, serving as an emblem that has grown to embody reliability, traditional American principles, and the noble character of family-owned farming operations. However, the authentic beginning of the John Deere commercial empire diverges significantly from tales of steadiness and security. Instead, it represents a chronicle rooted in urgency and desperation. This narrative commences not with an affluent business magnate overseeing his vast holdings from a position of comfort, but rather with an anxious individual escaping under cover of darkness, staying barely ahead of legal authorities pursuing him. The enterprise that would ultimately contribute to nourishing populations across the globe was established during a moment of crisis, born from the circumstances of someone fleeing serious consequences. During the fall season of 1836, the community of Rutland, Vermont presented an unwelcoming environment for any individual facing financial difficulties. John Deere had reached his 32nd year of life, possessing exceptional skills as a blacksmith with capable hands and an inventive intellect. Nevertheless, he found himself overwhelmed by mounting financial obligations. The nation's economic system had experienced a catastrophic failure. Commercial enterprises were closing their doors permanently. The individuals and institutions to whom he owed money had lost patience with verbal assurances and future promises. During that historical period, the inability to settle one's financial accounts extended beyond mere economic disappointment. It constituted an actual violation of the law. The ominous possibility of incarceration for unpaid debts cast a dark shadow over the Deere family household. This represented a harsh, tangible threat that could potentially consume his entire existence. The choice he executed on a chilly November evening was severe, born of absolute necessity, and reflected his dire circumstances. With reports indicating that the local law enforcement officer was preparing to place him under arrest, John Deere made the difficult decision not to remain and confront his situation. Instead, he chose flight. He gathered a modest collection of his remaining blacksmithing implements into a small traveling bag, embraced his wife Demarius in farewell, knowing she was expecting their third child, and departed through the rear entrance of their home. He abandoned his family members to face the humiliation before his creditors without him, making a solemn commitment to arrange for their reunification only if he managed to survive the challenging journey ahead. He had become someone evading legal consequences, an individual stripped of his social standing and reputation, traveling westward into the enormous and intimidating unexplored territories of the American frontier with merely $73 in his possession and legal documentation authorizing his apprehension. His travels eventually brought him to a small, dusty community in Illinois bearing the name Grand Detour. The settlement's designation carried an element of bitter irony for someone who had been compelled to take an indirect route through his own life's journey. The town consisted of little beyond a scattered arrangement of roughly constructed cabins clustered near the Rock River, representing a location where organized society was engaged in an uphill struggle against the forces of nature. In this remote location, amid the mud and isolation, the fugitive metalworker established his forge and workshop. He hoped to vanish from his previous life, to earn a modest existence by creating horseshoes and performing repair work on shovels and other implements for the local farming population. However, he rapidly discovered that the agricultural workers of Illinois were confronting challenges far more substantial than his personal troubles. The Midwestern region had been presented as a land of extraordinary opportunity and promise. The earth was fertile, dark in color, and remarkably productive, presenting a stark difference from the stone-filled gray soil characteristic of Vermont. Yet there existed a significant problem hidden within this seemingly ideal ground. The soil possessed a heavy, adhesive quality with the consistency of thick, sticky paste. The farming families had transported with them the traditional cast iron plowing equipment they had utilized in the eastern states. Unfortunately, these plows proved completely ineffective in this new environment. The black earth would adhere stubbornly to the rough surface of the iron, blocking the blade's progress every few feet of advancement. A farmer would be forced to halt his team of oxen, manually scrape the accumulated mud from the plow using a wooden paddle, proceed forward another short distance, and then repeat this exhausting process again. This represented physically demanding, spirit-crushing labor that wore down even the most determined individuals. People were abandoning their efforts. They were loading their wagons and returning to the eastern territories, defeated by the very soil that was meant to provide them with prosperity. John Deere observed this ongoing struggle from the entrance of his workshop. He witnessed the exhaustion clearly visible in the expressions of these hard-working men. He saw the hopelessness affecting families who were experiencing hunger despite living upon the most fertile soil anywhere in the world. His blacksmith's analytical mind began working on the problem. He recognized that the issue did not originate with the characteristics of the dirt itself. The problem resided in the properties of the metal being used. Cast iron possessed too rough a texture. It created too much friction with the soil. He required something with a smoother finish. He needed something capable of moving through the adhesive earth with the ease of a sharp blade cutting through soft butter. He needed steel material. The significant advancement occurred through what might be called fortunate accident or perhaps predestined discovery. In 1837, during a visit to a local sawmill facility, Deere noticed a broken steel saw blade that had been discarded and abandoned in a corner. Within that jagged fragment of scrap metal, he envisioned future possibilities. He transported the blade back to his workshop facility. He heated it within the forge until it radiated a subdued, intense red glow. He hammered it repeatedly, bent it into shape, and polished the surface until it reflected light like a mirror. He was not simply manufacturing a tool. He was engineering a revolutionary solution to a widespread problem. He attached the curved steel blade component to a wooden handle structure and transported it to a neighboring farmer's field for practical testing. The outcome exceeded all expectations and seemed almost magical in nature. The polished steel material cleaned itself automatically as it advanced through the earth. The sticky black mud slid effortlessly off the metal surface. The plow moved smoothly as it carved a clean, perfectly formed furrow across the prairie landscape. This represented the first self-polishing steel plow in recorded history. In that transformative moment, John Deere transitioned from being a fugitive blacksmith into becoming the individual who would enable the agricultural development of the American West. He had unlocked the potential of what would become the nation's breadbasket. He had provided the farming community with the essential tool they desperately needed. However, achievement and prosperity for John Deere did not represent liberation from his internal struggles. It merely represented a transformation in their manifestation. The anxiety about poverty, the persistent memory of the law enforcement officer approaching his door in Vermont never truly departed from his consciousness. It evolved into an unrelenting, driving pursuit of perfection. He developed an intense preoccupation with quality standards. He experienced profound concern that if he produced a single inferior plow, the entire enterprise would collapse and he would find himself back in the position of facing incarceration for debt. He became known for telling his business partners with conviction that he would never attach his name to any product that did not contain the absolute best effort he was capable of providing. While this sounds like an admirable corporate principle, for Deere it functioned as a protective mechanism. It served as the guiding principle of an individual still operating from a place of fear. As the demand for his plowing equipment increased dramatically, the small workshop facility in Grand Detour became inadequate for production needs. The isolation that had initially provided him protection was now constraining his business growth. He required access to a river for transporting his steel materials. He needed proximity to railroad transportation. In 1848, he executed the decision to relocate his entire operation to Moline, Illinois, a community situated on the banks of the mighty Mississippi River. This relocation marked the beginning of what would become a commercial empire. He constructed an enormous factory facility, a towering structure of industrial activity where the sounds of hammers never ceased their rhythmic pounding. John Deere arranged for his family to join him in this new location. Demarius and their children, including his son Charles, finally reunited with him. They were no longer the family of an individual facing criminal charges and financial ruin. They had become prominent figures in the riverside community. However, the shadow cast by past experiences continued to linger. John Deere had become a stern individual, hardened by the intense heat of his forge work and the harsh conditions of his earlier flight from Vermont. He raised his children not in an environment of leisure and relaxation, but rather in the shadow of the factory operations. The business enterprise became the family's central focus and guiding principle. The plow represented their altar of devotion. The unfortunate aspect of this initial chapter can be found in the fundamental characteristics of the legacy he established. John Deere provided salvation to the American farming community, but he bound his own family to the company with chains of obligation. He instructed them that survival required constant, exhausting vigilance and attention. He taught them that rest represented a form of danger. He forged a work ethic that proved as durable and inflexible as his steel products. However, he neglected to temper this approach with warmth and compassion. As he advanced in years, transforming from the craftsman in the leather apron to the gentleman in formal business attire, he established the foundation for a family dynasty that would accumulate unimaginable wealth, but would experience very limited peace and contentment. The fugitive had ceased his physical running, but he never stopped metaphorically looking over his shoulder with vigilance. He constructed a factory to ensure he would never again experience poverty. However, in accomplishing this objective, he created an entity that would demand constant feeding by the generations that would follow him. The green machinery was born into existence. However, the cost of participation was a life dedicated exclusively to constant labor and effort. Standing in the background was his son Charles Deere, a young man who had observed his father's struggles closely and who would take that underlying anxiety and construct it into a fortress of brick and stone architecture. The blacksmith had successfully survived the wilderness challenges, but the true cost of building the empire was about to be paid by the son who would construct his residence directly above the industrial smoke and noise. When the elderly blacksmith John Deere finally ceased his labors and departed from this earthly existence, he left behind a legacy that possessed sufficient weight to overwhelm a person of lesser strength. However, his son Charles Deere was not such a person. He represented a creature of an entirely different character. If the father had been the artist who skillfully coaxed the steel into desired shapes, the son functioned as the commanding general who organized it into a powerful army. Charles did not possess the roughened hands characteristic of a craftsman. He possessed the calculating, strategic vision of a business titan. He took the successful plowing equipment business his father had initiated and transformed it into an unstoppable industrial powerhouse. Under his leadership and command, the company ceased to be merely a local phenomenon and became a global commercial force, a massive enterprise that absorbed competitors and came to dominate the American agricultural landscape. In 1872, Charles Deere determined that the leader of the plow industry required an appropriate residence befitting his status. However, the location he selected for his estate reveals the intense, obsessive nature at the core of the Deere family dynasty. A typical wealthy industrialist of the Gilded Age historical period would have constructed his mansion at a considerable distance from the noise and pollution of the manufacturing district. The Vanderbilt and Rockefeller families built their summer residences in Newport or the Hudson Valley region, creating vast expanses of manicured lawns and quietude between themselves and the source of their financial wealth. They desired to mentally separate themselves from how their wealth was generated. Charles Deere wanted to observe the wealth generation process while he consumed his dinner meals. He selected a steep bluff formation in Moline, Illinois, a high limestone ridge that loomed directly above the extensive factory complex on the riverbank below. He designated the estate property Overlook. The name was not employed as a metaphor or symbol. It served as a literal description of the residence's primary purpose and function. Charles hired the most skilled architects available to construct an expansive Swiss architectural-style mansion with 7,000 square feet of living space, elevated ceilings, and elaborate woodwork throughout. It represented a beautiful residence filled with the finest furniture pieces and artwork that financial resources could purchase. However, the orientation and positioning of the house served a singular purpose. It was designed with enormous windows that faced down the hill, maintaining an unblinking view of the forest of smokestacks releasing coal smoke into the atmosphere. This structure was not simply a home for family living. It functioned as an observation tower for surveillance. Charles Deere treated his residence as a monitoring facility, a location from which he could survey his industrial empire 24 hours each day. He would position himself at the window of his study chamber, coffee cup in hand, and observe the morning shift of workers filing through the factory gates in organized lines. He would observe the color and density of the smoke rising from the foundry operations. If the smoke appeared black in color and thick in consistency, he understood the furnaces were operating at high temperature and production was proceeding efficiently. If the smoke thinned in consistency or ceased entirely, he understood there existed a problem requiring attention, and he would be communicating by telephone or marching down the hill within minutes to address it. He did not create separation between his personal life and his professional work because he did not believe they constituted separate things in any meaningful sense. The factory represented the organ that pumped the lifeblood through the system. The house served merely as the brain that directed operations. Living at Overlook meant existing inside the machine itself. The sensory experience of the estate did not consist of peace and tranquility, but rather of constant rhythmic industrial activity and noise. The massive trip hammers in the factory below, pounding steel material into plowshares, created vibrations that traveled up the limestone bluff formation and into the foundation of the house structure. The delicate crystal glasses in the dining room cupboards would tremble in synchronization with the stamping machines below. The family consumed their meals to the rhythmic heartbeat of the factory operations. There existed no silence at Overlook. There existed only the persistent, distant roar of American capitalism actively at work. Additionally, there existed the problem of soot and pollution. In the late 19th century historical period, there existed no environmental regulations or restrictions. The John Deere factory facility burned tons of coal every single day of operation. The smoke did not simply disappear into nothingness. It rose upward. Because Overlook sat positioned on the ridge directly above the chimney structures, it sat in the direct path of the pollution stream. The pristine white linens imported from European sources would transform to gray coloration within hours of being placed on the tables. The velvet drapery materials retained the faint acrid scent of burning coal permanently. The housekeeping staff waged an eternal losing battle against the dust from the foundry operations that coated the windowsills and the banister railings. For Charles Deere, this atmosphere represented the scent of achievement and prosperity. He breathed the coal smoke as though it were fresh mountain air. However, for his family members, for his wife Mary and their daughters, the house functioned as a gilded cage suspended in a cloud of smog and pollution. They possessed wealth beyond what most could imagine. They represented the royalty of Illinois society. They traveled to European destinations. They wore the finest silk garments available. They hosted elaborate parties and social gatherings. However, they could never escape the physical reality of the business operations. The source of their privilege was simultaneously the source of their pollution exposure. They were trapped in a cycle of production and consumption, living in a house structure that was physically shaking from the force of the money being generated below. This proximity to operations bred a unique form of psychology within the Deere family members. They developed a sense of duty and obligation that approached the level of self-sacrifice. They were not merely owners of a business. They were caretakers and stewards of something larger. They felt the weight of responsibility for the thousands of men working in difficult conditions in the heat below. They felt the eyes of the entire town focused on the house positioned on the hill above. Charles Deere functioned as a demanding patriarch who expected his family members to uphold a standard of rigid perfection in all matters. He was efficient in his methods, serious in his demeanor, and utterly consumed by the company operations. He did not maintain hobbies or leisure activities. He did not maintain diversions from work. He had the plow business and nothing else. As the years ground onward relentlessly, the house became a physical manifestation of Charles's inability to release control. He expanded the estate property, adding additional rooms, additional gardens, additional walls and boundaries, but he never altered the view that mattered most. He needed to maintain visual contact with the fires below. He needed to hear the factory whistle signals. The irony of Overlook lies in the fact that it was constructed to demonstrate mastery and control over the land and industry. However, it ultimately proved that the land and the factory operations had mastery over the man himself. He was the wealthiest individual in the entire region. However, he was a prisoner of his own creation, tethered to the window view, watching the smoke rise continuously, experiencing profound concern that if he looked away even for a moment, the fire might extinguish itself completely. By the time Charles Deere approached the end of his lifespan, the estate had become a local landmark structure, serving as a symbol of the town's industrial strength and capability. However, inside the walls of the residence, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken weight. The joy of the family members was constantly filtered through the demands of the business operations. Charles had forged a company of steel materials, but he had also forged a life characterized by iron-hard discipline that left very limited room for softness or tenderness. He had built a mansion structure where the walls vibrated constantly and the air tasted of sulfur compounds. As he prepared to pass this responsibility to the next generation, he ensured that his daughter and her husband would not simply inherit a fortune of financial resources. They would inherit the view from the windows. They would inherit the noise pollution. They would inherit the obligation to stand at the window and observe the smoke rising continuously. Forever bound to the machine that churned operations below them. The blacksmith's fugitive escape had concluded, but the marathon of the Deere dynasty was just beginning its course, and the finish line was nowhere visible on the horizon. In 1907, the iron-strong heart of Charles Deere finally ceased its beating. The man who had transformed a blacksmith workshop into a global empire, the man who had lived his entire existence in the shadow of the smokestacks, collapsed under the accumulated weight of his own ambition and drive. He left behind a company that was the envy of the industrial world throughout. A fortune that was staggering in its scale and magnitude, and a house positioned on the hill that was still watching everything. However, he did not leave behind a son to assume the throne of leadership. The Deere name in the direct male line had reached its conclusion. The burden of the legacy now shifted to rest upon the shoulders of his daughter Catherine, and more specifically to the man she had married, William Wiman. This transition marked the beginning of the era known as the Deere-Wiman House period, a time when the estate transformed from functioning as a command post into operating as a pressure cooker environment. William Wiman was a capable individual, a man possessing intelligence and drive, but he was not born of the fire and the forge like his predecessors. He had married into the monarchy of Moline society. He was the prince consort stepping into the boots of a giant figure from history. The pressure upon him was immediate and overwhelming in its intensity. He was not simply managing a business enterprise. He served as the custodian of a legend and a legacy. He bore responsibility for the livelihood of an entire city population. The eyes of the workers, the eyes of the shareholders, and the ghostly eyes of the old blacksmith were all fixed upon him with expectation. William threw himself into the work with an intensity that mirrored the founder's flight from Vermont decades earlier. He attempted to be the general that Charles had been before him. He sat in the executive offices. He walked the factory floors regularly. He lived in the mansion on the hill, staring down at the sprawling beast of industry that demanded constant feeding and attention. However, the beast possessed an insatiable hunger, and William was only human with human limitations. The strain of managing the colossal John Deere company, the endless conflicts with labor unions, the volatile market conditions, and the overwhelming expectation of perfection began to erode his health gradually. He was an individual trying to hold back an ocean tide with only a shovel as his tool. In 1906, just 1 year before Charles Deere officially passed from this world, the stress claimed its first major casualty. William Wiman passed away. He had reached only 44 years of age. He did not perish in a factory accident or incident. He did not pass away from old age and natural causes. He was ground down progressively by the relentless friction of the responsibility he had inherited through marriage. The burden of the Plow legacy had claimed him as a victim. He had been given the keys to the kingdom of industry, but the crown of leadership was so heavy in its weight that it broke his capacity to bear it. He left Catherine as a widow with 2 young sons to raise, trapped in a massive house structure that vibrated with the noise of the machinery that had contributed to ending her husband's life. The estate, now officially known by the designation of the Deere-Wiman House, became a place of tragic grandeur and melancholy beauty. Catherine Deere-Wiman was a woman of immense inner strength and fortitude, a true daughter of the Iron Titan Charles Deere. She did not flee from her responsibilities. She did not sell the company to outside interests. Instead, she raised her sons, Charles Deere-Wiman and Dwight Wiman, to understand the gravity and weight of their family name. The house structure was expanded with additional sections. It became even more opulent and luxurious in its appointments. Gardens were manicured to absolute perfection. Servants in starched uniforms moved silently and efficiently through the halls performing their duties. However, the underlying frequency and rhythm of the home remained identical to what it had always been. It was a golden cage suspended above an active volcano of industry. The focus of the family story now narrowed to concentrate on the eldest son, Charles Deere-Wiman, named after the grandfather who had built the house originally. He was the chosen one from birth. From the moment he entered the world, his destiny was welded to him like iron bonds. He was not permitted to be just a boy experiencing childhood. He was the heir apparent to the throne. He grew up in the nursery at Overlook, listening to the factory whistle blow its signals, knowing that one day he would be the individual pulling that cord himself. Consider for a moment the psychological landscape of growing up in that particular house environment. You are a child surrounded by wealth that most people can only dream about experiencing. You have ponies for riding. You have private tutors for education. You have fine clothes tailored specifically for you. However, every time you look out your bedroom window, you see the blackened sky from industrial smoke. Every time you sit down to consume dinner, you feel the subtle tremor in the floorboards as the drop hammers pound the steel materials down the hill below. You are taught from an early age that the men working in difficult conditions in the heat below are your personal responsibility. You are taught that the family honor and reputation depends on the quality of a plowshare product. It is a childhood characterized by extreme privilege and advantage, but it is simultaneously a childhood of extreme indoctrination and preparation for duty. Charles Deere-Wiman was bred and prepared to be an industrialist in the same systematic way a racehorse is bred to run at maximum speed. When he finally assumed control of the company operations, he was the synthesis and combination of the two bloodlines. He possessed the Deere grit and determination, combined with the Wiman sensitivity and awareness. He moved into the master suite of the house on the hill, occupying the same rooms where his grandfather had watched the smoke rising, and his father had worried himself to an early death. The atmosphere of the house in the 1920s decade was one of frantic luxury and nervous energy. The jazz age was in full swing throughout the nation. The parties at the Deere-Wiman Estate were legendary in their scale and extravagance. Champagne flowed freely in abundance. Music drifted out over the limestone bluff into the night air. However, beneath the surface appearance, the tension was readily apparent and palpable. The family was trapped in a gilded yoke of obligation. They were the oxen pulling the cart of the American economy forward. They could not cease their efforts. They could not step aside from their responsibilities. To sell the company would constitute a betrayal of the bloodline and family history. To allow it to fail would be considered an unforgivable transgression. Therefore they worked continuously. Charles Deere-Wiman became consumed by work. Driven by the same internal struggles that had chased his great-grandfather across state lines, he paced the floors of the library late into the night hours. The light of his cigar glowing in the darkness, creating a mirror image of the glow from the foundry fires below the hill. He held the position of master of the house, but he functioned as a servant to the legacy and its demands. The unfortunate aspect of this era of the estate's history is the loss of personal autonomy and freedom. The Deere-Wiman family possessed everything that money could purchase except the freedom to simply walk away from their obligations. The house was beautiful in its construction, filled with art and culture, but it essentially functioned as a high-end dormitory for factory management personnel. The sprawling lawns and the beautiful scenic views were a thin veneer covering the industrial reality underneath. The family existed primarily to serve the machine of industry. They were the high priests of a religion centered on steel production, and the house served as their temple of worship. As the years passed in succession, the physical connection between the home and the factory became a powerful symbol of their entrapment in this lifestyle. In most dynastic families throughout history, the third generation retreats to the city centers or the coastal regions, becoming softer and more distant from the source of wealth. However, the Deere-Wiman family stayed positioned on the bluff above. They remained in the soot and pollution. They remained in the noise and vibration. It represented a stubborn, gritty kind of loyalty that approached the level of self-punishment. They refused to separate themselves from the source of their power and influence, even as it extracted a heavy toll on their happiness and well-being. The house stood as a monument to duty and obligation above all else. It was a place where fathers passed away at young ages and sons were drafted into the commercial battles before they were old enough to shave facial hair. The green machine was feeding populations across the world, but it was slowly consuming the family that had created it from within. As the roaring 20s decade came to a crashing halt and the dark clouds of the Great Depression began to gather on the horizon ahead, Charles Deere-Wiman would find himself standing at that same window location, looking down at the now silent smokestacks below, facing a threat that could potentially destroy everything his ancestors had built over generations. The fortress positioned on the hill was about to be besieged by poverty and economic collapse once again, bringing the story full circle back to the fear experienced by the fugitive blacksmith at the very beginning. The financial crash of 1929 did not just shatter the stock market system. It silenced the heartbeat rhythm of Moline completely. For nearly a full century of time, the rhythm of the Deere family's daily life had been set and determined by the thumping of the trip hammers and the roar of the furnaces down the hill below. However, as the Great Depression swept across the American landscape like a devastating storm, the orders for tractors and plows evaporated into nothingness. The farmers who represented the lifeblood of the company were experiencing dire financial circumstances. The agricultural fields were transforming into dust. For the first time in multiple generations, the smokestacks below the Overlook estate ceased breathing fire and smoke into the air. The silence that descended over the valley was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had ever been throughout the decades. Charles Deere-Wiman, the grandson of the Iron Titan Charles Deere, found himself standing in the center of his own personal nightmare scenario. The fear that had driven the fugitive John Deere to flee Vermont nearly a century earlier had returned to haunt his great-grandson in the present day. The company was experiencing severe financial losses. The board of directors was in a state of panic and alarm, but Charles refused to surrender to circumstances. He sat in the library of the mansion surrounded by the leather-bound books and the portraits of his ancestors gazing down, and he made a decision that would define his legacy for future generations. He refused to terminate the employment of the core of his workforce. He kept the factory running on minimal resources. When the company exhausted its cash reserves to pay the men their wages, he famously issued them checks that were essentially promissory notes, backed only by the honor and reputation of the Deere family name. He wagered the entire fortune, the entire estate property, and the entire future of the family on the belief that the American soil would eventually yield productive fruit once again. He spent those dark years pacing the floors of the Deere-Wiman house, a prisoner of his own sense of responsibility and obligation. The stress was corrosive to his health and well-being. He aged rapidly during this period, his face taking on the gaunt, hardened appearance of the men who had come before him in the family line. The house was no longer a venue for jazz-age parties and celebrations. It had transformed into a bunker under siege from economic forces. The lights in his study chamber burned until dawn broke each morning, a lone beacon on the hill, signaling that the captain remained at the wheel of the ship, attempting to steer the vessel through a hurricane of economic devastation. He succeeded eventually, pulling the company back from the brink of collapse and into the boom period of the post-war era that followed. However, the victory came at a significant personal cost. The grinding anxiety of those challenging years, the sheer weight of carrying an entire city's welfare on his back, left deep scars on the family's collective psychology. In the years following the recovery period, a significant shift occurred in family patterns. The tether that bound the family to the Bluff location finally snapped apart. The noise of the factory operations, once interpreted as the sound of money being made, had become unbearable to endure. The soot particles, once considered the smell of success and achievement, was now simply recognized as filth and pollution. The new generation of the family, perhaps finally recognizing that living inside what amounted to a smokestack was a recipe for misery and discontent, decided to leave the estate. They moved away from the Deere-Wiman house to other locations. They sought out quieter neighborhoods and communities, places where the air was clean and breathable and the ground did not shake from industrial operations. They abandoned the fortress that had been their family's center. The great mansion stood empty for a period of time, a silent sentinel continuing to watch over a factory that no longer required a king to watch over it from above. It was eventually donated for public use and benefit, transforming from a private residence into a museum facility and a center for historical education. Today in the present time, you can walk through the heavy wooden doors of the Deere-Wiman house structure. You can stand in the dining room where the crystal glassware once shivered from vibrations. You can look out the windows at the view that obsessed Charles Deere for his entire life, but visitors often remark on the atmosphere that pervades the place. It does not convey the feeling of a home filled with warmth and laughter and family joy. It feels serious in nature. It feels imposing in its presence. It retains the stern industrial gravity of the men who built it and occupied it. The furniture pieces are stiff and formal. The portraits on the walls are unsmiling and severe. It is a house structure that commands respect and admiration, but it does not invite intimacy or warmth. The legacy of the Deere-Wiman Estate is a complex tapestry woven from threads of steel and threads of sorrow combined together. The family accomplished exactly what the fugitive blacksmith set out to achieve when he fled Vermont. They conquered poverty completely. They built a brand that is recognized in every corner of the globe today. They contributed to feeding populations across the world. However, the price of the green machine empire was a family life that was never truly their own to control. They were servants to the soil and bound to the steel production. They forged a dynasty that changed the course of history, but the steel hardened their hearts in the process. As you depart the estate and drive down the hill past the modern factory facilities that still produce the massive green tractors today, you realize the final irony embedded in the American dream narrative. John Deere ran away to escape a prison cell, but his success built a different kind of cell structure for his descendants to occupy. It was a cell constructed of velvet and marble materials, a cell with a scenic view, but a cell nonetheless in its function. The plow broke open the prairie landscape, but the factory broke the peace of the family. On the quiet bluff in Moline, the house still stands today, a beautiful yet lonely monument to the concept that in the pursuit of building a great empire, the first thing you must sacrifice is your rest and peace of mind.